want to dwell on two topics mainly. One is freedom of expression or the lack of it, and it ties with growing anti-intellectualism in Turkey, and then the attempt to a masculinist restoration or a backlash, you could say. Now, obviously, freedom of expression had always been restricted in Turkey, from the time that I've known myself, it was always restricted, but it was always fought against as well. We had, in my lifetime, I've seen 3 military coups and the, of course, consequences of those, etc. And recently, or how shall I say, after 1990s and early 2000s, the laws have been a bit ameliorated, I would say, but still, laws, for example, anti-terrorism legislation, criminal defamation, and the law prohibiting insulting Turkishness, which are all very vague, you can understand. They were always there. But the situation has become more dire after the July 2016 attempted coup in Turkey. And because afterwards there was a crackdown on the opposition and the rule by executive decree surely just diminished the rule of law in Turkey. But from like 2010 onwards, this was sort of coming. But as I said, July 2016 was sort of a threshold. And situation for free speech and media freedom deteriorated at breakneck speed. I mean, the reason is political, quelling critical and dissenting voices by a government that is moving ever closer to authoritarianism. Writers and journalists in Turkey have faced and are still facing detention and harassment from a judicial system whose independence and capacity to deliver effective legal remedy has been effectively undermined. Over 150 journalists and writers were imprisoned, and more than 180 media outlets and publishing houses have been closed down. Others have been arrested for their social media activity, their Twitter activity, etc. For otherwise peacefully exercising their right to freedom of expression. So people all of a sudden, find they're faced with criminal charges just because they've written 1 or 2 sentences on Twitter or exact things like that. After 3 years of imprisonment, 3 very renowned writers who were in jail for prison 3 years, just recently they were released. One was acquitted, the other 2 just released, and then one of them, Ahmet Altan, after a week or so, he is now again arrested and he is in prison. And of course, there is another civil society, very prominent civil society activist, Osman Kavala. He is still in prison, and with no real charges. So the judicial system is, really becoming terrible. And I would like just to give you one example. This is the Academics for Peace, and I was, of course, I witnessed this very closely. They faced terrorism-related charges for calling peace in the southeast of Turkey. And again, now, or shall I say, this was in January 2016, and 1,128 academics in Turkey and abroad, they signed a petition calling on Turkish authorities to cease state violence in mainly Kurdish populated areas. And they were under curfew and an extended state of emergency. This petition received an immediate reaction from the president, and he accused the signatories of treason and terrorist propaganda. And of course, he demanded the public prosecutors to launch an investigation, and they immediately obliged. A criminalization of the petition has been exacerbated by disciplinary activities or actions by universities against many of the signatories. Many have suffered insults, arrest, detention, suspension, or enforced retirement. So I have now many young colleagues who are retired, just early retired, who had to retire. So this has been sort of an instrument for de-radicalization of university, and filling the emptied ranks with pro-government scholars, if they could find any. That's another problem. Anyway, this was a massive crackdown on academic freedom, and it was masked by discourses of counterterrorism, and of course, the accusation of counterterrorism always been deployed to criminalize dissent generally in Turkey. So the criminalization of these academics, I think, should be seen within the larger framework of human rights violations, increasing curtailments of academic freedom and rising authoritarianism. And this was sort of another example of the tradition of trying to suppress academic freedom in times of political crisis. This was not the first time. We have seen it way back in 1970s. We've seen it again in 1980s, and it sort of keeps coming back all the time. But it is also a product of the rising authoritarianism of the ruling party. So, it's not only the tradition, but it's been enhanced a little bit. So when you look at Turkey in terms of human rights and right of freedom of expression, etc., you can see a tame justice system, enhanced and unchecked police powers, and the muzzled press. Of course, these are not good for human rights and freedom of expression. Anyway, the petition, if I want to come back to that, the petition itself and the subsequent events in the academy reflects a rise of anti-intellectual disposition, which is also a trait of populist authoritarianist governments. I mean, you can see it in other places as well, but in Turkey, I don't know, I can see it quite openly. While most sectors of Turkish society, including the media, Kurds, Alevis, and the land movement affiliated groups, have been under attack for the past several years, surprisingly, academics were left relatively unscathed, in this increasingly repressive political environment. But this last episode of the petition has changed that. The value of an educated person is judged less by her inherent intellectual qualities and more by the ideological support she can offer for a political cause or the immediate material benefits her position accrues. The culture of intellectual exchange has largely waned. Academics are reduced merely to their ideologies. Even the best universities in Turkey fail to surmount the challenge posed by anti-intellectualism and ideological schisms. Hiring processes, grant decisions, tenure awards are all increasingly determined by non-academic factors. And here is another point, that universities are becoming or more reluctant in hiring women, especially young women. Of course, this inegalitarianism or lack of equality for women had always been there, but it was not this open. So even, for example, Turkey has still some 38% women in academia. But now it's becoming much more normal for the department heads to say, when a woman candidate comes along, I'm not for women to work. I mean, I think women should stay at home, this sort of thing. These are the sentences that we're hearing for the first time, being voiced like this. But going back to the petition, recently the Supreme Court ruled that the petition falls into freedom of expression. So you see, all these people who were accused of terrorism, etc., the Supreme Court says this is freedom of expression. So the courts have begun to acquit them. But some of the courts are still obstinately not obliging, and they still don't have their posts back. So, after the acquittal, they should immediately be taken back to the academia, but that's not happening. I don't know if it will happen or not, but people are fighting and struggling against this. And there has been a really big solidarity, both from within and from abroad. Friends, families, and civil society organizations, etc. They really show the big solidarity. So, I think this is what largely brought about the acquittal of the academics as well. But then we'll see what will happen in the university. Now, the second topic I'd like to bring up is the attempt to restore patriarchal values and a backlash in the face of women's empowerment and subsequent progressive legislation concerning women's rights, because this really happened in Turkey. Now, the Turkish Civil Code of 1926, the first civil code of the Republic, had brought secularization of the family and improved women's status, but it still had patriarchal biases. For example, legally designating the husband as the head of the family, relegating his wife to being a helpmate, right? And the explicitly patriarchal clauses of this civil code were only to be amended by 2001, after a very long struggle, constituting one of the major achievements of the women's movement in Turkey. Then came the amendment of the Penal Code in 2004, in line to, make it in line with the Penal Code. And the diverse feminist groups, in the meantime, also succeeded to have a law for the protection of the family and preventing violence against women. This was in 1998. And like the case in Morocco, I think, this was a first of its kind, but still weak. And then in 2012, this was changed into a better one. I'll talk about that. Now, the Turkish civil code, penal code, for example, which was enforced from 26 to 2004, was the most striking example of the divergence between rhetoric and reality in Turkey, because there's this modernization rhetoric, secularization, and women's rights, etc., which are not to be denied. I don't want to underestimate them, but the inequality was there, and especially the gender stereotypes were not challenged until 1980s, when the new feminist movement emerged. Only after that, the gender roles in the family, especially, were challenged, and then we have all these new legal changes as a consequence of that. Again, like in Morocco, I think, this previous penal code treated rape as a question of honor of the family, right? It decriminalized marital rape, sexual acts within the context of marriage, even if forced, could not be considered a violation of a woman's honor. And it exempted a rapist from punishment if he offered to marry his victim, thereby restoring her honor. Even in the case of a woman raped by many men, an offer of marriage from one of them was considered sufficient for charges against all of them to be dropped. And as can be predicted, 1926 code was also very lenient to honor crimes. That is, crimes committed for the purpose of restoring a family's honor. One provision granted a reduction to the perpetrators of honor crimes where the victims had been caught in the act of adultery or illegitimate sexual relations, of course, including for women, sex before marriage. And if there was clear evidence that the victim had just completed such an act. The code also valued single women less than married women. Abducting a single woman could bring 3 years imprisonment, while abducting a married woman carried a minimum of 7 years. So, suggesting that the real victim in the latter case was the husband, just seeing women not as autonomous individuals, but properties of the father and the husband. Now, the persistence of these norms past the end of the 20th century I think was no mere legal anachronism, but reflected values embedded in Turkish society, including, of course, its judges and prosecutors and the police force. At the same time, as the 20th century came to an end, these values had begun to be increasingly contested, as demonstrated by the public reactions, to a number of highly controversial court decisions, which were really very much openly against women, and the overall struggle of women against violence and for equal rights. The new Penal Code had some 35 articles concerning women and their rights for sexual autonomy. These were changed, and all references to vague patriarchal constructs such as chastity, morality, shame, public customs, or decency were eliminated. This new code now treats sexual crimes as violations of individual women's rights and not as crimes against society, family, or public morality. Now, I'm not going into this very much, but I am, trying to make it explicit that these are really progressive new legislation. But although progressive legislation is important, of course, its implementation is much more important. And there is always a gap or a challenge between the law and its implementation. And in the Turkish case, this is really more poignant. Now, I talked about this law, about the protection of the family and preventing violence against women. It was changed in 2012. And this is the new regulations provide state assistance for victims of domestic violence, including new residence, financial aid, legal and psychological help, and police protection. Although not always observed by the authorities, but still they were seriously important for changing the status of women, and of course about bringing about an awareness about violence against women. So that because of that, I think all these progressive changes and amendments are under attack. And men, for the first time in Turkey, are creating civil society organizations and lobbies like Association for Victimized Fathers, right? Or a platform against alimony rights of women, etc. These things. I mean, this is the first time which is happening, and they are really lobbying a lot, both in the parliament and outside the parliament. And of course, the general ideological situation is quite making things comfortable for them, I should say. Because there is this ideological discourse and some policies of the government, they are trying to, promote gender inequality in their statements and in their discourses. Both the president, his government, and prominent MPs, etc. They aim to regulate citizens' private lives, from dictating how many children they should have, whether women should be allowed to have abortions and cesarean sections or not, whether they could drink or manifest in public, or manifest affection in public, etc. And women are called upon to have at least 3 children to combat the shrinking population. Women's bodies have always been an instrument of population policies of the governments. This is another example now. The biggest problem in sexual health care is related to limitations on family planning and the restrictions on abortion. Although abortion is still legal in Turkey, legislation has not been changed, but most public hospitals do not perform it, right? A lack of privacy of the healthcare database has prevented single women from resorting to hospitals for pregnancy tests, birth control, and abortion. Even the health minister declared, women should be mothers. Mothers have the career of motherhood, which cannot be possessed by anyone else in the world. Mothers should not put a career other than motherhood at the center of their lives. And of course, all women should be mothers. And the official ideology and discourse is sort of, if you are right women, that is, if you are mothers, you shall be protected, but not if you're not. If you're a single woman, LGBT woman, etc., etc. So this is being openly voiced, but still the legislation is there. Laws have not been changed. But along these official statements, there are pronouncements by conservative MPs and other public figures that it's improper for women to walk around the streets while they're pregnant or at night, and even that they should not laugh out publicly, etc. Obviously, women's say on their own bodies and reproductive rights are under attack. And women's rights groups are really very much concerned about this attitude. So you have, again, like so many other places, 8 marches, demonstrations, where women, for example, in the last 8 March, 9th March, it was called, like 100,000 women were on the streets. And, they were carrying banners, I'm not a mother, I don't want to be a mother, I don't want to be a mother, I'm a woman, and, deal with it. It's very humorous banners there too. And then most of the banners were like, we are not going to submit. And there was no crackdown upon that because it was really a very large demonstration, and the government always cracks down on all sorts of public demonstrations, even if they're very small. But lately, in 3 or 4 recent demonstrations, there was no meddling by the government or the police, which is interesting anyway. And another thing I should say, the president in one speech, he accused feminists of rejecting motherhood and of trying to erase gender difference in the name of equality. So as a result of this, pro-government women's organizations are talking about not equality, but justice, right? So gender equality, bringing similarity with men, but justice is something different. This is really what we know, like proportional equality. We know it way back from Plato onwards. You know, this is give the person due, his or her due. You know, if he is or she is to have her due, and if she is as in any Muslim society, she's a second-class citizen. So if you make her equal to men, it will be injustice to men, right? And this discourse has been voiced again. So again, there is this accusation of gender indoctrination. So the gender studies department have been accused of gender indoctrination. And now they're trying to change the names into women and family centers, things like that. So this enmity towards gender, I see it's all around the whole world. And for example, in Ukraine, I know the same thing is happening in Hungary. Orban has closed gender studies departments. And in Poland, I think something similar is going on in Baltic cities and Central Europe especially. So it makes the situation all the more frightful and dangerous. So I think against this global onslaught, perhaps we'll talk tomorrow about this, we have to have a global solidarity and, counter offensive, something like that. So I'm going to finish soon. Currently in Turkey, I think we can observe a conflict generated by the authoritarian conservative discourse in politics that promote fertility, domestic role of women as a counter reaction to the modernization that prioritizes empowerment of women in all spheres of social life. And of course, these policies and discourses link very much to the onslaught on LGBT rights. So, for example, in the last 3 or 4 years, the honor marches of the LGBTI people, they were banned. And just 2 or 3 days ago, I learned that in May, in Middle East Technical University in Ankara, although it was banned, people, students, and academics just held an honor march. And now 18 students and a few academics are under court detention, something like that. So these are really, they go hand in hand, I would say. But as in other countries, on the other hand, there are legal and institutional developments to prevent violence against women. And so there is a dilemma generated by policies aiming to suppress women within the family and these progressive legislation. And I think this contradiction engenders the reaction of men against the emancipation of women and their progressive legal regulations and their rights. A general reason for femicide, taking the name honor killings in the rural areas and passion killings in the cities, can be considered as aiming to preserve women's secondary position and to keep them from making their own choices. Especially women have, from all walks of life, and religious and non-religious, covered or uncovered women, they are using their rights more and they're asking for divorce increasingly, right? So, but because of that, women are dying for trying to get a divorce, because the pretext used mostly by men who murder women, they say, she didn't obey me by asking for a divorce, or after being divorced for so many years, if she tries to get married again, she's punished. You know? She did not obey me is sort of a, a call word, a motto of these men. As I say, because women have started to say no more. And then, as I say, they're asking for divorce more increasingly. So the traditional patriarchal bargain seems to be dissolving in Turkey, right? Due to women's gained rights and economic independence, especially in big cities. And this is why now big cities have become more dangerous for women. So, there was this discourse that, violence against women is a rural thing. It's a Kurdish thing out there in the southeast, not within our educated secular people. No, Istanbul is now have become the most dangerous city for women, right? So, and the femicides among educated men are happening more and more, which is really very interesting. And so I'm asking if the government's conservative discourse, which calls women back to family, urging them to be good mothers and spouses, putting motherhood before a career, and to participate in part-time jobs. Of course, this is another thing, to meet the flexible and precarious labor force need of the market, because neoliberalism and this market authoritarianism are going hand in hand. You have to think about that as well. Is this a reflection of, the will of the government to manage the fear that stems from the dissolution of the patriarchal bargain by trying to reestablish it through familial conservatism, the strengthening the family? This is what men call, they ask for too. They now everybody is for family values, and they have started to remember love too, love between spouses, love between family, etc. Nobody used to talk about this before. This is another interesting thing. And now, empowerment of women in domestic negotiations, of course, changes the traditional roles of women as wives, and this increased societal acceptance of divorce challenge the household dominance of men and create counter reactions. Men who engage in violence are very resentful about this new law, or family law, that I mentioned, because it orders punishments like suspension from house, psychological treatment for men, and expropriation of guns, and especially the lack of limitations to divorce, right? These they really don't like. And hence their enmity towards the European Convention Against Violence Against Women, which is known as the Istanbul Convention, which was open to the signing in Istanbul. So it is called the Istanbul Convention. And Turkey was the first country to approve it, ratify it. But now these men's lobbies are calling for the repulsion of this convention. But I know that, I mean, voices are being raised from Central European and Baltic states as well. I mean, they are the ones who are part of the EU, and they're taking or collecting signatures for a petition to the European Union to annul this the convention that they have drafted, or not drafted, of course, they've written. These so-called Association of Victimized Fathers protest that these new laws tear the family apart by giving more rights to women. Very explicit. And then these resentful lobbies are, as I said before, really trying to do really good work. They call themselves Platform of Victims of Alimony, and they fight to change the respective legislation. They have defenders in the parliament. And the worst thing is soon, we know that a draft has been prepared now, which will curb alimony for women. And we hear that this package will also bring back another terrible article. It will diminish penalty given to child abusers if they offer to marry the girl child. You know, this was really changed way back, almost 20 years ago. And now, again, they're trying to bring it back. And they're doing it in a very clever way, because this alimony controversy, we have supporters from many men, not only from pro-government or religious men, but secular and so-called democratic men. They don't know the word of the law very well, and they think it gives, limitless alimony right to women, which is not the case. But still, there is this propaganda around it. So these lobbies are starting with this change, restricting the alimony rights of women. And then inside the package, they're putting more or worse reactionary articles as well. So, women's rights defenders are really panicking around it, and they're putting a very good struggle. And there are lots of civil society organizations, women's rights organizations in Turkey. Women's rights movement is really strong, like in Brazil. And they have immediately opened a petition to be signed by women, and 10,000 of women just signed it from every walk of life, covered, uncovered, religious, non-religious. And they opened also a petition for men to sign too, but it was not very successful. I mean, not even 1,000 men signed the petition. I think we should, try again now. But it shows that, that men think, this is okay. Women's equality is good. Women's rights are good, but this is women's problem, right? Let them deal with it themselves, all right? They don't see how this links with democracy and rising authoritarianism and women's rights. Everything is a whole package. So I think now, all will depend, of course, on the women's struggle. once again. But then I think the attitude of men who see themselves as Democrats will be important as well. And I think this will be the case more or less everywhere in the world. So perhaps men should really understand that this is not a woman's thing. You know, women's question is more than women's question, or feminism is more than feminism. Okay, thank you.
Perhaps we can get some questions for Fatmagul to start with. Yes?
I have one about the...
Yeah, but you should speak louder, please.
Yes.
My ears get worse after a plane flight.
So the men organizations we were talking about in Turkey, the ones that are lobbying for fathers that have been...
I can't hear you.
maybe...
You can come maybe to it.
Wait, I can tell you. If you ask, I'll say it.
So I'm wondering about these men organizations in Turkey. Why you think they have come to me now? If it's like a reaction to female or feminist organizations, or if it's a reaction to women. If you could just elaborate.
Okay. Yeah. As I tried to say, reaction against women's organizations, but reaction against women's gained rights, which is a real backlash, which will be if we lose them. Okay, I mean, legislation is not everything, but it is very important. And it was making sort of waves. It does make waves, right? And it does bring an awareness against violence against women. Now, I mean, I remember way back in late 1980s when feminists wrote about violence against women, rape, marital rape, etc. These were really taboo questions in Turkish society, which were voiced for the first time. Now everybody talks about them. It's all over, and and people demonstrate, people support anti-violence demonstrations, causes, etc. So it's really widespread. But I think especially when economy is getting worse on the one hand, and you have this ideology of manhood and honor and everything, but they cannot, I mean, men cannot be the sole breadwinners anymore. And women, on the other hand, have been empowered. They go out, work, they get education, and they're using the rights given by these progressive legislations. So there is this contradiction there. These men are brought up by families, and they, with swollen egos, and their egos depend on making women obey, right? So it's because of that the most important pretext is she didn't obey me, and this can take so many guises, like she didn't obey me, she asked the hour to a strange man, she didn't obey me, she wore blue jeans, she didn't obey me, she telephoned someone that he doesn't know, right? This can be anything so banal, from that to wanting to get a divorce. I think this is what makes them really furious. And then they say down with gender, because gender makes the domestic roles or stereotypes of women, challenges that, it's not natural. It is social, we say. So in Turkish, gender translates as social sex, to delineate the social construction of gender. So that's why, they really furious against it. But in Ukraine, men demonstrate, saying down with gender too. So, this gender ideology thing is used by everywhere by men or toxic masculines.
Yes, toxic masculinity. Anybody else? Yes.
I want to ask something like honestly. So what is the
I'm really glad.
Yes. Can you raise your?
So what is the reaction of the government of Turkey in figures of honesty? Do they have any rule or is there immediate support of this? Like in some countries, the government doesn't want to involve in this matter.
Well, in this course, they don't support, right? And they don't support especially violence against women too, especially if the woman is right sort of woman. That makes a big difference. But the whole ideology and ideological discourse is, against this, really. Women are not free and autonomous human beings. They should be part of the family. They are always part of the family. So now they're starting to talk about family rights, not women's rights or gender rights, not at all. And another thing is the judiciary, of course, the judges, prosecutors, and the police. They're not very keen about, finding the murderers and, bringing them to the court, etc. And usually, some courts give reduction in sentences just because the man wore a tie or, he has been respectful to the court or his good manner, and they get reductions, etc. So it's more about the implementation. But when the law is there, you can always, call to it and then demand that it should be applied. But now the dangerous thing is that they are trying to change the law, which I find really very dangerous. So that's what we have to fight for, really.
Yes.
You're so very outspoken for women's rights. Do you feel safe in Turkey? Do you feel safe in Turkey?
Well, I do. I do. I mean, as much as I feel safe anywhere in any other country, I think no woman is really safe in any society. And it can happen to all of us all the time. And that's what I'm saying to, for example, women who think they're privileged and who think they're protected. And I think this is really the cause that binds the feminist movement together. Violence against women can happen to any women, anywhere. For example, I mean, when I was studying in the UK, that was the most frightening time for me, in a way. I really felt very in danger, in a way. So I don't think it makes a lot of difference. Of course, in Turkey, you have men looking at you in nasty ways, or whistling, wolf whistles, etc., etc. But that happens everywhere too, I think. But I think it's more of a matter of marital relations. It happens in the family, within the marital relation, when woman is more empowered and starts to act more freely, and then it really endangers her in a way. Not the streets, but family, in my opinion, is worse.
Yes, there was a question here.
Jag som är kurd, kvinna, hur ser kurdiska situationen och normer och värderingar ut i Turkiet?
What is the situation regarding the courts? The courts, yes.
Yes.
In Turkey. Är det kvinnosituation för kurderna? Women's situation among the courts and the rights in Turkey?
Okay. Well, Kurdish women's movement is really very strong. Recently, women have been empowered a lot. But lately, of course, there is this offensive in Syria by the Turkish government, and the offensive is an international relations thing. I think it's not only Turkey, it's Russia, it's America, it's Syria, etc. But Turkish government is using the war there to crack down on the political party of Kurds, a Kurdish People's Party, a Democratic People's Party. And because they have voted for opposition in the Kurdish areas, and then they were in a coalition with the People's Party, the opposition party. And I think now the government, the president, is trying to punish them for that. And so all the elected mayors, for example, in that region, affiliated to the Kurdish political party, they're being taken back, and some of them arrested, etc. So the war or the situation out of the country is being used to curb the democratic rights of everyone, and especially the Kurdish political party, because Kurdish political party is a real force in politics, and he is trying to sort of divide the opposition, which were in a coalition, especially with the Kurdish party and the People's Republican Party, right? So I think there is a policy, very clever or criminal policy towards that.
Okay, I think that we have to stop now, but the thing is that we are having technical problems to reach Skanimara. So we decided to start with the coffee break now. And we have about half an hour for coffee break, and then we come back. Okay? And the coffee break is downstairs, waiting for you.